Hi, Ben Shute here with some thoughts on Sarasate's Carmen Fantasy. Before we dive into anything, I think it's worth considering that what we're dealing with here is essentially an operatic piece. So sometimes this piece gets a little bit of a bad rap as a shallow showpiece, and I think that's a little unfortunate because Bizet's score really is very good music. And I think we as violinists, if we can approach it as an operatic piece, rather than an obstacle course to be overcome, but incorporate all of the drama and the lyricism and the emotions that we would want to hear from Bizet's score, I think we will be serving the music well, and I think our audiences will get all the more out of it. So with that as a background, I'm just going to mention a few points that might be interesting to consider as we go through the fantasy, in hopes that some of this will be helpful. So starting right at the beginning, we have this luxurious G-string melody. In the operatic score, you're going to hear it played by an oboe, a very different affect. The fact that Sarasate has put it on the G-string, I think we're probably going less for the an oboe-like sound, and I think we can just enjoy the rich G-string sound on the violin. But one thing to be careful of, sometimes we'll accidentally hit that third note a little bit more than we mean to because of the retake. So if we can think of the melody going toward that first downbeat and releasing into the third. Now I'm exaggerating, of course, just to illustrate, but we want to keep good sound and intensity. But so we can just be conscious that the downbeat is the downbeat with all the weight, and then the third eighth after the eighth note rest, the third eighth of the bar is something of a release, and I think that will give a nice shape to the melody. Okay, the next thing probably that's worth mentioning is the passage in sixths, and all of that. Now, full disclosure, I loathe sixths. I would take a passage in fast thirds any day over a passage in sixths. But alas, Sarasate has written sixths, and it really does sound very nice. It's just I just find it uncomfortable because you have to do a lot of this with your fingers. But actually, the first thing that I think about when I come to this passage is my bow. Now, maybe it's just me because I find sixth uncomfortable, but I tend to keep my bow arm. I tend to want to put my bow arm a little higher than is good for me. So in order to, so the sound can be a little bit surfacey and hissy like that if I'm not careful. So I have to really, for me, be careful to keep my arm low and in the string. And that also helps to define the beginning and the release of each note, which gives it a more resonant sound, which also helps the intonation, because the more focused the sound is in our ear, the more clearly our brain can process the intonation in the microsecond that it needs to. So, I would encourage you to think about your bow. If there's any issue with sound, maybe like me, you have to think about keeping the arm down and relaxed. Okay, but that said, I think probably the fact that sixths are a little bit uncomfortable is why you'll often hear some sort of tricks done instead of. A lot of people you'll hear on some recordings that. So what I'm doing is actually, I'm not playing a sixth in the second note. I'm keeping the A in place. And that's something you'll commonly hear. Similarly, instead of, there's another place where people will often keep the second finger in place. Sometimes, though, I like to stretch that a little bit. Just, if you want to milk that a little bit more, then yeah, the sixth can be lovely. But it is an option if you want to move a little bit more quickly and just have more forward motion. That's a possibility as well. One final thing that might be worth considering in this first movement are these downward glissandi that we find quite a bit of actually throughout the whole piece, where you have these sort of almost melodramatic sighing glissandi on the violin. The trick is to get them precise enough. I don't think it needs to sound, because we don't want it to sound dry either. We want it to have a nice sweep to it, but we also don't want it to sound right. So we want to have some definition to it. What I like to do, and it might be more helpful to turn this way. One thing that some people recommend is just kind of, it's like doing a vibrato and then moving the hand down. I find that, for me, a little bit less helpful than just thinking about locating the thumb here and moving. So I think it's almost like I'm shifting. I lighten the hand and re-engage and really feel like and that in each position I'm really genuinely stopping. And then when I get to about here, obviously you can't keep pushing back with your thumb. So the thumb is what anchors my hand as the hand lightens and re-engages. But once you get to here, that mechanism stops working quite as well. So at that point, I keep the thumb back and re-engage a little bit as my hand inches its way down and tries to keep the same feeling of motion that it had at the top. I like personally to think in groups of fours as far as where to focus my ear. So if I start on a D, think B flat, F sharp, and I don't think you have to have perfect pitch to be able to do this. If you can just used to the interval of a major third. The sound of an augmented triad, and if you can keep that in your ear, I think will help you to get the kind of precision that you're looking for going down, so that you get approximately the right number of notes. Now, I think, again, I don't think it needs to be that sort of a feel, and I don't imagine that Sarasate spent hours and hours himself practicing the minutia of this run, but we do want to have a feeling of a precise run that then also has the sweep that we want from a glissando like this. Okay, the second movement, I guess it's properly the first movement, but it's the first movement after the introduction, but the second movement of the piece that we come to, the famous Habanera. To keep in mind here, it's tempting to make the notes a little bit shorter and faster than is optimal in a hall. I actually remember one time hearing a performance of the Tchaikovsky concerto, and in the third movement, it's that beautiful, beautiful mellow melody in the violin, and but from the middle of the hall, there's a violinist who had very, very quick fingers. It sounded like that because I could, if I look closely, I could see the fingers, the hand move, but I couldn't hear the grace notes because they were just simply too fast to carry well in a hall. So a little bit of extra intentionality. We don't want to, and we want to make sure that each note has body to it, because if you think of a vocal staccato, an opera singer is never going to go ha. It's never going to be that kind of sound. Ha, 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 not ha. So we want to do the same thing with the bow. I mean, we can go very short and think nothing of it, but we have to imagine that the bow is the breath. So not too short and not too thin-bodied sound on these notes, even though they are in piano, and not too quick a grace note. We want it to be a bit intentional. And these grace notes, one doesn't say they should be sharp, but they should certainly not be flat. I'll leave it at that. Okay, the slow movement after that is fairly straightforward, as are many things in the following the. One thing that's probably worth mentioning as we get in, we have this nasty passage in runs and harmonics, then augmented, and then now most editions will write. There's a handy trick that you can do. So you're doing 1 4 1 4 1 4. If you just put the second finger down, I don't know what the best angle to see this is. I'm always a little bit nervous about playing harmonics that are smaller than a natural 1 to 4 placement because they don't speak quite as readily, and sometimes you have to. You have double stops in harmonics. It will often call for a harmonic the space of a major third, and then we just have to make the best of it. But they're more difficult to make speak. But for some reason, this one, the F sharp to B, and then if we put the second finger down where a G natural would be, I find that one quite reliable, and I've seen that used in concert sometimes. So that can be a helpful trick, so you don't have to save your hand a little bit of jumping around. Toward the end of the movement, we have this nasty run up, and then in octaves that's a little bit uncomfortable to play. So first thing to think about, so we have 8th, 8th, and then triplet 16th. When the eighth, the downbeat, the 8th note G, I don't think about that as an 8th note, honestly. I think about it more like something in the area of a 16th, dotted 16th. And then toward the end of it, I'm already starting to shift. So don't think about ending an 8th note and then trying to, hit an octave up there. Don't be afraid to start shifting a little bit early to make sure that you can hit it. And then what we have to do is make it sound like that was stylistically intentional. So give a little bit of swish with the bow. And if you a little bit also of making the finger a little heavier as you get into the note, it can make it sound like you're intentionally being just a smidge early. That's why pardon my voice. That's why I play the violin. But it can give the sense of being just a little bit early in order to have a stylish effect. Whereas in actuality, we're also doing it because it's just very uncomfortable to play in tune. Once you get to these octaves, it's very easy for them to start sounding just like straight 16ths. So what I do, I actually don't think of them as triplet 16ths. I think of them as 2 64ths followed by a 16th. And at speed, because the bow change just takes a little bit of time, it will actually sound and feel like triplet 16th. So if you think of them as 2 64ths followed by a 16th, that will guarantee that we hear the last of the triplets, the lower octave, enough that we don't miss it altogether. Because when we miss it, that's when it sounds like just straight 16th notes. So that's a little trick that you can use there. All right, so then getting into the final movement, the Gypsy Dance. This one is so tricky because those thirds, if they're not really in tune, then it can just and we don't really know where we are. So the trick is to make sure that when we shift down, it's really, really in tune. So here's how I practice. I practice with a little bit of a break before the shift. So I even when I go fast, I'm trying to think of that little pause to just set up. And then I gradually shrink that space. But at the same time, I'm thinking of giving a little bit of metrical accent properly to the first of every four. And that keeps the ear oriented and also keeps the audience oriented, so it doesn't just sound like... We really can feel a... So I think that's important to keep in mind. Then once we've, we think, okay, I did it. And the following thirds can be out of tune if we're not careful. So I actually find that really making sure that those are in tune is really essential to the success of this passage. For me, the fingers I have to think about are the D sharp on top, and now the D sharp on bottom. If I think about if I really focus on the D sharps, maybe it's just because with my hand they can go flat, and if they do, then the whole thing sounds a little chaotic intonation-wise. But so for me, that's what I have to focus on. Okay, then D minor, since we clearly didn't have enough of that. Then this one is just nasty because the second finger has to go from the E string over to the A string, and it's just very very unpleasant. So I would just do a lot of it. It's like just say the tongue twister over and over again. Okay, for the next bit, then it goes into B minor. This is a nasty one because the violin just doesn't speak very. This is probably the hardest one in terms of the area of the violin to get it to project. If you need a little bit more projection, so the motion is actually the inverse of what we did at first. Shift, shift, shift. This time, shift up. So I do 1 and 3, and then I go 2, 4, open 2, and practicing with the same sort of break. That can be a possibility if you need a little bit more projection without forcing the fiddle. Because up here, if you try to give too much, it can actually make the sound even hoarser, and it doesn't necessarily help the projection. The next one, if you've done the E string for the first one, I'd recommend the E string also for the second one. And you can just do that in second position. 0, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3. For the final one in G major, I actually cheat a little bit. This is the hardest one for the fingers because you go from minor thirds to a major third. And it's just... Actually, one seldom hears this really well in tune. It's just very, very difficult to make the hand work at speed in concert, in context of the whole thing. The last time I played this, I honestly cheated here. What I did, I just stayed in second position and played the B with the fourth finger on the D string against an open G string. I'm not convinced that over an orchestra you can hear the difference. So that's a possibility. One other thing to consider, right at the very end of the piece, we have the... And that whole becoming frantic section at the end. If when it comes back, if you find yourself needing a little bit more power, particularly over an orchestra. Now the orchestration is well done. I mean, it's the pizzicatos down in the lower register of the strings, minimal winds. But if you feel like you need a little more power, there's a way that you can add octaves without all the difficulty of fingered octaves without cheats. So here's... Sorry, I'm going a little bit out of tune here. It's humid in here, but... If you go... So 2, 4... Open string... 2, 4... just the open E makes us think we're hearing an octave where we haven't actually heard one. And then I'll just do an open string and an octave over the two middle strings. Similar principle here. You could do 1-4. I like 2-4. Open 2-4 1-3. Oh, now for this last one would be the hardest to do in octaves, and I admit I cheated altogether. Having done octaves up to this point, if you break it very dramatically so that the listener's ear is oriented toward the top, and then only play the bottom, but hold it a little bit over long on the first note, and then move along on the next U. At speed, again, we don't really detect that we're not hearing octaves. And then, a bit like a passage in the gold mark that has a similar, the first movement has a similar. And then we're off and running to the end. Again, that's just a, if you feel you need a little bit more power, it's a way you can add some octaves without all the difficulty of unadulterated octaves. It's a possibility. But in any case, I hope that's interesting and helpful to think about. So, as always, happy practicing. Thanks for watching.